Hello everybody, it is Professor Leung and today we will be talking about the Chenopodiaceae family, and you can find the page numbers for the associated plants you need to know on the left hand side of the screen, which you can find in your North American Wildlands book. So the first plant we're going to talk about is the four-winged saltbush, also known as Atriplex canescens. It is a native perennial plant which is evergreen, and it grows as a shrub up to 3 meters tall. It's dioecious, which again means it has separate individual plants that produce only male flowers or female flowers. Occasionally a bush might be monoecious, which means it might produce both of those types of flowers on the same plant. Typically it grows erect, stout, and has a lot of branching, and it usually flowers from May to September and reproduces primarily from seed. So four-winged saltbush, or Atriplex canescens, has inflorescences that are arranged in panicles and has flowers that are unisexual and apetalous, which means the flowers don't have distinguishable or conspicuous petals. The flowers are unisexual, which means that a single flower will only be staminate, meaning it has pollen, or pistillate, which means it receives the pollen. The staminate flowers are typically in dense clusters on spicate branches in a terminal panicle, whereas the pistillate flowers are often in short axillary spikes appearing as terminal panicles. The fruits are urticles enclosed in a pair of two-winged bracts. An urticle is a dried fruit similar to an achene. And so in the image here, you can see the fruit itself, the urticle, and then you can see the bracts and the wings as well. Vegetatively speaking, the leaves are simple and they are arranged alternately on the stem and also sometimes in fascicles, which mean, again, multiple leaves come out of a single portion or spot. The leaves are oblong in shape and they can range to ovate to lanceolate, and oftentimes they have a gray scruffy color and often become glabrous with age. The leaves are sessile or subsessile, meaning it's attached directly to the stem or it's very weakly petioled. And the stems have twigs that are rigid, erect, and are a grayish to yellowish or tanned color. They are pubescent when they're young, which means they have a little bit of hair, and then as they age, they become glabrous or hairless. The bark is thin and tight around the bark and gray in color, and the plants are highly variable in size, leaf shape, and the fruiting bract size and shape. Historically speaking, four-winged saltbush or Atriplex canescens was used by different Native American tribes to make flour when the seeds were ground up, or to mix in to drink with sugar and water. The Navajo used the leaves and stem to make a yellow dye. However, the pollen can cause hay fever and can be a reactive allergic allergen for people. The forage is good for cattle, sheep, goats, pronghorn, and deer, and it provides valuable winter forage sometimes when less is growing, and the fruits are especially good food for wildlife. In terms of livestock losses, concentrating feeding could cause scours in cattle, and there are some unsubstantiated claims of toxicity to goats through anecdotal stories, but it hasn't been necessarily shown with data. In terms of habitat, it typically occurs in bluffs, hillsides, deserts, and saline or alkali flats in many different soil types. Next, we have shad-scale saltbush, or Atriplex convertifolia, which is a native perennial plant, which grows as a cool season shrub, almost a meter tall. And it's a dioecious plant, which again means it has individuals that produce solely female or pistillate plants and solely male or staminate plants. It's late deciduous, not to be confused with dioecious, which means it drops leaves during dormancy. And the crown of the plant is typically rounded, and it's also densely branched and rigid and spinescent, which means oftentimes it has a point or some spines or a rigid sharp point. It flowers from July to August, and in terms of its fruit and inflorescence, it generally produces spicate clusters of flowers. And those flowers, again, are unisexual, which means only one, either pistillate or staminate, and are apetalous, which means no discrete petals. And the staminate flowers are often arranged in terminal, along the terminal end of the stems in kind of dense area, in kind of like a dense cluster, subtended by leafy bracts. Oftentimes they have 4 to 5 calyx lobes, and they're green in appearance and often scruffy. The pistillate flowers often are solitary or could be clustered in upper leaf axils, and oftentimes are subtended by 2 fleshy ovate bracts. And they also appear to be green, scruffy, and united for about 1/3 of the length along that flower. The fruits are again also in urticles, enclosed with wings with persisting pistillate bracts similar to leaves, as we can kind of see here. Here's the urticle, and here's the bracts and wings behind it that helps it disperse. Vegetatively speaking, the leaves are alternate and simple, and oftentimes the leaves are shaped in an ovate fashion or triangular, or they can be elliptic, and they're often thick. The margins are often entire, and they are gray-green in color. They have a scruffy kind of feel to them, and oftentimes the leaves are also petioled, which means they have like a little stem connecting that leaf to the twig branch. And just to clarify, scruffy is essentially rough to the touch. It might be covered in scruff, or maybe scales, or some type of abrasive kind of texture. The stem twigs are rigid, often grow erect and stout, and are spinescent, which again means they are spiny, and often yellow-brown in color, and can be smooth or scruffy. The trunks are irregular and often appear in clusters of older branches. The bark is light to dark gray and again somewhat scaly. Shad-scale saltbush or Atriplex infernifolia historically was ground. The fruits were ground into flour by different Native American tribes, and used similarly as the last one, kind of mixed with water and sugar, or to be used as flour. Forage-wise, it's good for all classes of livestock, including and wildlife like pronghorn and mule deer. And it makes good winter and spring browse. And the fruits provide especially good food for game and songbirds. These shrubs are also resistant to heavy grazing. And they typically occur in desert valleys, hills, bluffs, and in stony or clayey alkaline soils. They can also form almost pure strands or stands on certain locations, or in some locations, which means they kind of create a monoculture. But they also frequently grow in association with Stipa hymeneoides, another plant we've covered before. Next up, we have winter fat, or Ceratoides lanata. It is another native perennial plant, and it grows as a cool season subshrub up to 1 meter tall. It is usually monoecious, which means both the pistillate and staminate flowers are on the same individual plant, but occasionally, rarely, they can also be dioecious, which means, again, they produce either male individuals or female individuals. They often grow highly branched and kind of have an herbaceous look with branches ascending. It flowers usually from April to September and reproduces primarily from seed. So winter fat, or Ceratoides lanata, has inflorescences that are clustered and spiciform, which means they often are shaped like a spike. And the flowers are unisexual and apetalous, which again, no petals. It has staminate flowers that are terminal and axillary in clusters of 6 to 8 flowers, and it has staminate calyx lobes in fours with white and green stripes and woolly outsides, while it's glabrous or smooth and hairless on the inside. The pistillate flowers are form on axillary or solitary kind of clusters of 2 to 4 flowers. And the pistillate flowers are subtended by 2 bracts and bracteoles that are green and pubescent, hairy. And the fruits themselves, again, are urticles, dry fruits like achenes, enclosed in 2 bracts, and those bracts are lanceolate and horned above. Oftentimes, they're covered with 4 tufts of long white hair, like you can essentially see right next to me. Vegetatively speaking, winterfat or Ceratoides lanata has leaves that are arranged alternately and also are sometimes in fascicles, and they produce simple leaves, not compound leaves. And the blades are often linear to narrowly lanceolate, as you can see in the image above me. And the margins are acute and revolute, whereas it's also covered in dense red or white stellate and simple hairs. The midrib of these leaves are often prominent, as you can see right here. And oftentimes the leaves are sessile or petioled. So that means they may be attached directly to the stem, or they could have a small petiole attaching them. The stems have twigs that are gray to reddish brown and are stout and ascending, and are covered with dense stellate and simple hairs. And if you're unsure what stellate means, it essentially means hairs coming out from a center single spot that radiates out like a star. And so that usually means it has very dense hair. The trunk itself is dark gray to brown, and often is exfoliating or peeling. Winterfat Ceratoides lanata historically was used by the Blackfoot tribe, and they soaked leaves in warm water to make hair wash. And other tribes used it as a remedy for fever, also made from leaves. Forage, it's good for sheep, pronghorn, elk, and mule deer, and fair for cattle. And it's usually most valuable in the winter when there's less growing. In terms of habitat, it grows on hillsides and mesas, foothills and plains, and is most abundant in subalkaline or chalky medium to fine soils. So next up, we have halogen or halogen glomeratus, and that is an introduced or non-native plant from Asia, which is an annual forage species. It grows as a warm season forb, 5 to 30 centimeters tall, and often has few to a lot of branches coming out from a base. And the stems are spreading first, and then erect or ascending. And so you can kind of see the stem spreading here, and then becoming ascending here or erect here. It flowers from July to September and reproduces primarily from seeds. Halogen has inflorescences that are in axillary clusters and are distributed throughout the aerial portions of the plant. The flowers are essentially perfect or pistillate only, and so there's no staminate flowers only. And they are also apetalous, which again, no discrete flowers, and often are small and inconspicuous. And oftentimes the calyx has 5 lobes, is rounded and persistent, and often is enlarging into a yellowish or reddish fan-like wing with maturity to, again, aid with dispersal. And the fruits are also achenes, and oftentimes they have a coiled appearance, as you can see in the image above. Halogen, vegetatively speaking, has leaves that are alternately arranged, also sometimes fascicles, and often they make simple leaves. The blades are linear and tubular and fleshy, kind of like a succulent plant, like you can see above, and oftentimes very smooth. The margins are entire and not serrated at all, and often have a rounded apex or end with a short bristle. It has a bluish to greenish kind of color, and often also is scruffy, which kind of has that scaly feel. And it has leaves that are, again, are sessile, which means they don't have petioles and they're directly attached to the plant stem. The stems are red when young and they turn yellow to white with age. They often are glaucous in the type of like a powder they produce on the stem. And oftentimes they are very striking when they're growing with very bright red stems and blue-green leaves. Historically, it was introduced to North America as sometime in the 1930s and has rapidly spread, becoming a bad invasive weed. And it's especially of concern for rangeland managers because it's poor forage for both cattle and sheep, but can provide some usable forage only and when mixed with other forage plants in small quantities. It is considered poisonous and contains toxic amounts of sodium and potassium and calcium oxalates. And sheep are most susceptible to this type of toxicity. The first signs of poisoning usually occurs 2 to 6 hours after an animal ingests a fatal amount, and death usually occurs 9 to 11 hours after ingestion. Habitat includes dry deserts, barren areas, heavily grazed prairies because it's not a desirable forage species, roadsides, and other disturbed sites. It's especially abundant in alkaline and saline soils. And our final plant of the week is black greasewood, or Sarcobatus vermiculatus. And it is a native perennial, and it grows as a warm season shrub up to 2.5 meters tall. It's a monoecious plant, which means it produces both the pistillate and staminate, the pollen-bearing, pollen-receiving portions or flowers on the same plant. And it's late deciduous, which means it drops the leaves during its dormancy. And oftentimes it grows erect or spreading and has a lot of rigid branching. It flowers primarily from May to August and reproduces both from seeds and resprouts. So black greasewood, or Sarcobatus vermiculatus, has inflorescences that are both staminate and pistillate, but they're monoecious, so they occur on the same individual plant. And the staminate flowers are arranged in terminal axillary catechin-like spikes, as you can see right here in this image. Oftentimes, pistillate flowers are solitary or paired in the leaf axils below the staminate flowers, and they are sessile or short pedunculed, which means they're attached to the stem, or they have another additional stem that kind of shortly extends it off of that main stem. The flowers are unisexual and apetalous. The staminate flowers are subtended by a scale or a stipite bract, which is essentially a small modified leaf. And the calyx of the pistillate flowers are turbinate and pubescent in green. Pubescent means hairy, like pubescent. And the fruits are in achenes enclosed by persistent perianths, which are modified structures near the flower, which form a wing that assist in dispersal. The wings are veined, green to tan, or reddish. So black greasewood, or Sarcobatus vermiculatus, has leaves that are all arranged alternately along the stem. The leaf blades themselves are linear to filiform, which are thread or needle-like. They are elliptical in shape and often have four angles in a cross section, and they're glabrous or with stellate pubescence. So that means they could be hairless or they could be hairy. And the leaves themselves are sessile, which means they aren't petioled. And the stems have twigs that are spreading to divergent, which have many branches, are rigid and spinescent, which means it forms spikes or spines, and often are a whitish to tannish color. And the trunk bark is yellowish gray to a light brown, and oftentimes the trunk bark is fissured and exfoliating, so cracked and exfoliating, peeling, and can be shiny in appearance with elliptic shaped pits on the trunk. So black greasewood or Sarcobatus vermiculatus historically was sometimes used as wood for fire or fuel. And sometimes the sharpened branches can also be used as planting tools. In terms of forage, it makes good to fair forage for sheep, goats, and big game in the winter, and is important food and cover for small mammals, jackrabbits, and birds. In terms of livestock losses, it has soluble oxalates, which have caused mass mortality in flocks of sheep. And cattle and horses, however, are rarely poisoned by this plant. The young twigs, though, can be especially toxic to sheep. It grows in dry plains, slopes, eroded hills, and on flats, and especially in alkaline and saline soils. So with that, that is going to be our last plant and plant video for RRS 306. I hope you guys learned a little something new about plants, and I'll see you in class soon.